The woman known to history as Jane Seymour, the third wife of Henry VIII, was born at her parents' country estate of Wolfhall in Wiltshire sometime between October 1507 and October 1508. It is unclear why her exact date of birth is not recorded, but considering that Jane was her parents' seventh child and first daughter, her exact date of birth was probably not considered to be worth remembering. Neither is her early life particularly well documented. Jane's father was Sir John Seymour. The Seymours had served as caretakers of Savernake Forest in Wiltshire for centuries, and Sir John himself served as the local sheriff and justice of the peace. His 1,200-acre estate provided a comfortable but by no means impressive living by the standards of the contemporary nobility. The most complimentary term for the Seymours in the context of Tudor England would probably be country gentry. Sir John had served and fought alongside Henry VIII in France in 1513 and 1514, earning the young king's admiration for his bravery and loyalty. Much of Sir John's social capital came from the gratitude of his king for his military service, but also from his marriage. Jane's mother, Lady Margaret Wentworth, was a descendant of Edward III. Lady Marjorie, as she was more familiarly known, had a more aristocratic bloodline than her husband, making her an impressive catch for the likes of John Seymour. She was reportedly a quiet, kind, and gentle woman, and Jane's biographers speculate that she may have inherited her notable docility, quiet dignity, and compassionate demeanour from her mother. Sir John and Lady Marjorie had 10 children, 6 of whom survived to adulthood. The sedate and provincial life of the Tudor country gentry was not suited to those with ambition, and Sir John made efforts to educate his elder sons and launch political and military careers for them in the king's service. Jane's eldest brother, Edward, and her third brother, Thomas, both rose steadily in consequence and esteem throughout the reign of Henry VIII. Jane's education was far less varied or academically rigorous than that of her older brothers. She was not a noble lady. Gentlewoman was probably the most exalted term which could be applied to her, and the Seymours were not nearly wealthy or important enough to merit providing an elite education for a daughter. Jane was taught to read in English, and she could sign her name, but it is unclear whether she was ever taught to write or how well developed her skills may have been. She could speak a little French and seems to have had a nodding acquaintance with Latin, but this seems to have been the extent of her academic training. Jane would have learned to dance and been trained in the social etiquette of polite society. She was said to be an excellent horsewoman and enjoyed following the hunt both as a young woman and years later by Henry's side as queen. Jane would have had opportunities for amusements and social niceties, but much of her early life and education was probably designed to prepare her for genteel domesticity. She would have been instructed in the duties of mistress of the house, including caring for the family, acting as hostess, planning menus, and supervising and directing servants in all of the tasks required to keep the house running on a fairly large estate. It is also quite possible that Jane, her mother, and her 3 younger sisters were more directly involved in household work than one might suppose. Their estate was entirely respectable, but the family did not belong to the leisure class. This distinction could be clarified by how much or how little housework was done by female family members directly. English noblewomen rarely put their hands to any domestic task. The Seymour daughters, especially Jane as the eldest girl, may very well have been taught to cook or been expected to perform domestic chores. It is known for certain that Jane was well schooled in sewing and embroidery, 2 skills at which she particularly excelled. The fine, intricate and artistic quality of her needlework was apparently remarkable enough for samples of it to survive for a century and a half on display in Hampton Court Palace. Jane's surviving tapestries were gifted to the descendants of the Seymour family in the 1650s. Next to household matters, it may perhaps have been Jane's religious instruction which received the most attention. Sir John and Lady Marjorie were devout Catholics, as were the majority of the English prior to Henry's break with the Roman Church, and the Seymours kept a priest in permanent residence at Wolfhall until the 1530s. Jane's continued attachment to Catholicism and her noted sympathy for persecuted Catholics during Henry's Reformation probably stemmed from her early religious education. Jane is described by multiple sources as kind, gentle, meek, and rather shy in company. Many historians suppose that the portrait which Hans Holbein painted of her in 1536 is probably a fairly good likeness. Jane is painted with a round face, a pointed, somewhat pinched chin, thin lips, and a prominent nose. She was described as having had very pale skin, greyish-blue eyes, and golden or strawberry blonde hair. More than one contemporary observer suggested that she was plain rather than beautiful, and one of her biographers has considered it worth emphasizing that she remained unmarried until her late 20s, a very late first marriage for a Tudor woman. Jane's parents could not afford much in the way of dowries for their daughters, largely because educating sons and launching careers for them was so expensive. With a modest or non-existent dowry, a woman stood a better chance in the marriage market if she were pretty. Jane's younger sister Elizabeth, who is believed to have inherited her mother's reportedly exceptional good looks, was married in her mid-teens to an upwardly mobile young knight. There was some talk of a betrothal in the mid-1520s between Jane and Sir Robert Dormer's son, William, but her lack of a dowry was a sticking point with the Dormer family. Still unmarried at 19 years old, Jane was finally able to secure a place as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon through the influence of her cousin by marriage, the courtier Sir Francis Bryan. It seems the primary objective in sending Jane to the English court was to help her to contract the most advantageous marriage possible. No one could have dreamed that her intended would be the king, and that within less than 10 years of her arrival at court, the quiet, plain, unprepossessing Mistress Seymour would become Queen of England. Jane arrived at Greenwich Palace near London sometime during the first half of 1527, roughly around the same time that Anne Boleyn returned from France to serve as a fellow lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine. Jane spent the next 5 years in the Queen's household, watching events unfold, particularly those which led Henry to divorce his first wife. Jane's quiet and serene demeanour gave no sign of what she thought about the very public relationship between King Henry and Anne Boleyn. Her admiration and devotion to both Queen Catherine and her daughter Princess Mary only increased the longer she remained with them at court. Her high regard for both mother and daughter would become much more evident later on. Jane was almost certainly discreet enough not to air her opinions about Anne Boleyn's relationship with Henry or about Anne's conduct toward Queen Catherine and her daughter. If she had shown any open disapproval or hostility, it is doubtful that Anne Boleyn would have retained Jane as one of her ladies-in-waiting when she became Queen Anne. Jane spent 2 years in Anne Boleyn's household, and throughout most of this period there is no evidence that Anne was at all dissatisfied with her service or her attitude, and this tells us 2 very intriguing things about Jane Seymour. First, she may have appeared mousy, placid, and obliging, but she obviously kept her own counsel and played her cards close to her chest. Secondly, Jane's conduct toward Anne, both before and after Henry began to court her, suggests that the woman whom most people probably took for a doormat had a vivid streak of ambition. It is not known exactly when or under what circumstances Henry and Jane first began to take a romantic interest in one another. They appeared quite enamoured with each other by January of 1536, but the affair quite possibly began earlier. Queen Anne became pregnant for the last time midway through the previous October. Since sex during pregnancy was believed to be dangerous for the child, Henry's notorious roving eye may have wandered over to Jane as early as November of 1535. In fact, it had been whispered at court that Henry had even been pursuing yet another mistress. This woman, whose name we do not know, is mentioned in several sources dated 1534, less than a year after Henry's marriage to Anne. On the 29th of January 1536, the day of Catherine of Aragon's funeral, the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis claimed to have observed Henry paying marked attention to Mistress Seymour and giving her gifts. Later that same afternoon, Queen Anne was said to have stumbled upon a private meeting between Henry and Jane, flying into a rage at finding one of her ladies sitting on her husband's knee. Reportedly, Henry quickly sent Jane from the room and attempted to calm Anne for fear that her distress would harm their child. This account comes from Jane Dormer, the Duchess of Feria, who, many years later, claimed to have heard it during her service as lady-in-waiting to Queen Mary I. Yet, since it was recorded so many years after the event, the veracity of the story is uncertain. What is certain is that roughly at the end of January, perhaps that very night of the 29th, Anne Boleyn miscarried her last child. In a letter dated the same day, Ambassador Chapuis informed the Imperial Foreign Minister that he had attended a secret meeting with Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister. Cromwell had confidentially expressed the king's wish for a renewal of his alliance with Emperor Charles V against the King of France, Francis I. Cromwell also apparently related to Chapuis a private discussion he had had earlier that day with the king, during which Henry had supposedly confided his belief that he had entered into his marriage seduced by witchcraft, making his marriage invalid, and that he was resolved to take another wife. Jane's last few months in Anne's service were, no doubt, extremely tense and difficult for both women. Henry was not nearly discreet enough in paying court to Jane, whose mistress, the Queen, still had power over her. Anne's star was fading. She knew it, and it made her anxious and highly temperamental. She was said to have slapped Jane on multiple occasions for perceived insolence, or for flaunting Henry's attentions before her mistress. It is unclear whether Jane actually did behave in such a way, or if Anne, consumed by jealousy, may simply have been watching her every move and venting her frustration at every perceived impertinence. One account suggests a very different image of Jane than her traditionally meek and obliging one. Sometime in February or March of 1536, Jane reportedly received a gold locket from Henry, which contained a miniature portrait of him. The story goes that Jane made a great production out of opening and closing the locket in front of the Queen. Enraged, Anne was said to have savagely ripped the locket from around Jane's neck, cutting her own finger in the process. As infuriating as Jane's presence was to Anne, she did not dare dismiss Jane from her service. The Queen was growing more insecure by the day, afraid to do anything which might inflame Henry's wrath or motivate him to divorce her. As her power ebbed, she was said to have dwelt sorrowfully on her treatment of Queen Catherine and Princess Mary. Jane's conscience, on the other hand, seemed untroubled by what would prove to be a complete and deadly triumph over her rival. Traditionally, Jane Seymour has been portrayed as a selfless, compassionate, kind, even saintly figure. Some of these impressions probably stem from Jane's actual conduct and behaviour in public, which gave most of her contemporaries an idea of her character with which they could all agree. Jane was quiet, gentle, and submissive, but it strains credulity to imagine that anyone could be completely free of judgment, bias, or even cold disregard, especially toward those whom one believes deserve judgment. Jane quite possibly despised Anne, just as more and more courtiers did throughout Anne's tenure as queen. She became more and more difficult to serve and to please as her anxiety increased. She had alienated a growing faction of political players at Henry's court who viewed with suspicion and hostility her attempts to influence Henry's policies and blamed her for the king's religious reforms. The most important considerations for Jane, however, were probably her staunchly Catholic faith, as well as her love, admiration and pity for Catherine of Aragon and Lady Mary. Jane's feelings and principles might have made her resent Anne above all for her Protestant reformism and her callous treatment of both Catherine and Mary. Far from being the saintly and selfless woman that liberated Henry from his cursed marriage, the real Jane Seymour was far more human. In fact, it may be fair to say that Jane captured Henry using exactly the same playbook Anne had used years before to seduce him away from Catherine. Two sets of circumstances, however, are still unclear. First, whether it was Henry or Jane who first attempted to initiate a romantic overture, and second, whether the romance bloomed of its own accord or was engineered by those courtiers who were desperate to see Anne removed as queen, the Protestant reforms halted, and Lady Mary restored to the succession. Tragically and fatally, Anne herself had created the possibility for her own eventual downfall. When Henry successfully divorced Catherine and married Anne, a Pandora's box was opened. If Anne could be queen, why not Jane? There were several courtiers who were, for various religious, political or personal reasons, committed to bringing Anne Boleyn down, including, most notably, the Marquess and Marchioness of Exeter, the Duke of Suffolk, Sir Nicholas Carew, Thomas Cromwell, Sir Francis Bryan, and Imperial Ambassador Chapuis. It is entirely possible that such a powerful group may have orchestrated the affair by manipulating events to help Jane catch Henry's interest. She was very likely coached and guided in the king's likes and dislikes by these individuals, as well as by her own family, who would, no doubt, have been ecstatic to see Jane capture the king. On the other hand, the affair between Jane and Henry may have begun more organically, and the conspirators may have approached her after the fact. Jane does not strike one as the type who would initiate a flirtation with the king of her own volition, so perhaps it was Henry who approached her. Some historians have wondered how Henry could spend so many years in love with women like Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn and then fall for someone like Jane Seymour. Catherine and Anne had both been highly educated, witty, charming, articulate, and conventionally beautiful. Jane could match Henry's first two wives in none of these qualities. Some historians have suggested that Henry may have fallen for Jane precisely because she was Anne's polar opposite. Henry had admired Anne's sophistication, wit, and passion, but did not appreciate her sharp tongue. Anne had been a difficult and demanding mistress, and now that Henry was growing older, his declining health no doubt made him increasingly impatient and irascible with anyone who challenged him. He may have found Jane's quiet piety, serenity, and meek submissiveness soothing and refreshing. Despite the recriminations between Henry and Anne, however, undoubtedly her worst sin of all was failing to produce a son. It is worth noting that Henry did not ultimately decide to pursue a third marriage until after Anne's last miscarriage. Sometime in February of 1536, Henry sent Sir Nicholas Carew to Jane, carrying a love letter and small purse heavy with gold coins. Sir Nicholas later informed the king that Mistress Seymour had refused to accept either the letter or the purse. He claimed she had held the letter for a moment, placed a reverent kiss upon the letter's seal, and then handed it back to Sir Nicholas without reading it. She had returned the gold also, and, falling to her knees before him, she entreated Sir Nicholas to beg the king's understanding that she was a woman of good and moral upbringing. She would suffer 1,000 deaths, she said, rather than sacrifice her honour. She thanked Henry for his gift, but requested that he might retain it for now and give it to her once she had contracted an honourable marriage. If true, this account is very telling. Jane had been accepting expensive gifts from Henry for months, which begs the question of why her scruples suddenly returned at this particular moment. Some historians have departed from the traditional image of Jane by pointing out that her conduct, in this instance, was straight out of Anne Boleyn's playbook, and shows that Jane herself followed a very similar strategy: respond to Henry's advances, but refuse to be his mistress, thereby forcing the issue of marriage. It worked on Henry like a charm, but then again, it appears that since Henry had no son by his current wife, he was more than willing to be beguiled. In returning his letter and the gold, Jane had behaved, Henry said, most modestly, and he resolved thenceforth only to pay court to Jane in the presence of one or more of her relatives. Accordingly, Henry promptly removed Thomas Cromwell from his chambers, which adjoined the king's, and gave them to Jane's brother, Edward Seymour. Now, he and Jane could continue to meet fairly privately, but still be properly chaperoned to avoid any scandal attaching itself to her reputation. By early March, some less than complimentary gossip had already begun to circulate throughout London about Henry's affair with Jane, and there was some sympathy for Queen Anne, who was obviously out of favour with her husband, the king. Henry had abandoned both Anne and their collapsing marriage by the end of February, leaving her behind at Greenwich Palace while he took up temporary residence at York Place in London. He continued to discreetly court Jane throughout the month of March. By the 1st of April, rumours of their meetings in Edward Seymour's chambers became more widely known at court. Henry then moved Jane out of Greenwich Palace to a royal residence in Chelsea, a short distance along the Thames River from York Place. This probably had less to do with protecting Jane's reputation, however, than with keeping her away from the ugly process already underway at court, the campaign to accuse Anne Boleyn of capital crimes, thus affecting her removal and execution. However, Jane could not have been ignorant of what Henry intended, even if she was most likely ignorant of the finer details. There is no account of Jane in which she reacts with anything other than her customary quiet serenity to the news that Anne Boleyn's death was imminent. Henry visited Jane the very morning that Anne was to be executed to comfort her and assure her that they would very soon be married. The traditional historical portrait of Anne Boleyn has often been that of the devious, grasping other woman, while Jane Seymour has often been portrayed as a paragon of gentle, unselfish compassion. Yet, the fact remains that Jane found it seemingly easy, as one historian put it, to step neatly over the dead body of her rival right into Henry's arms and onto the throne next to him, just as Anne had taken Queen Catherine's place, seemingly without a qualm. Henry and Jane were officially betrothed the very next day following Anne Boleyn's execution, and less than 2 weeks later, on the 30th of May 1536, the two were married in a small, semi-private ceremony in the Queen's Closet at Whitehall, with the religiously conservative Bishop Stephen Gardiner officiating. Jane's well-known sympathies for Catholicism and for the Lady Mary made many anti-reform courtiers hopeful that her influence on Henry might help halt the march towards Protestantism in England. Anne Boleyn's emblem as queen had featured a crowned falcon with the motto, "The Most Happy." Jane's choice of emblem as queen spoke volumes. Hers was a crowned phoenix. Her motto, "Bound to obey and serve." The message seemed clear. Through her faith and service as Henry's wife, England would rise from the ashes after the confusion and upheaval caused by the king's divorce. Eustace Chapuis was among the most hopeful, and he assured Emperor Charles V in a letter that he would encourage the new queen to continue in her efforts to restore Lady Mary both to Henry's favour and to the succession. In a subsequent conversation between Jane and Chapuis, she herself confirmed to him that she would always show kindness to Mary and seek to reconcile her with her father. Henry quickly broke up this confidence, perhaps uncomfortable with the notion of Jane exerting influence at his court on behalf of the emperor, at least indirectly. Making sure that a Catholic inherited the English throne was one of Charles V's principal foreign policy goals from the 1530s to the 1550s. Should Henry and Jane's marriage not produce a male heir, then Lady Mary stood a better chance of taking the throne with the Queen's support. As Queen, Jane did indeed advocate for Lady Mary. Even before she and Henry were wed, she had asked him to reinstate Mary as his heir. Henry had scoffed gently at the idea, advising her that, instead, she ought to be advocating for the inheritance rights of the children that Jane herself would have with Henry. But her subsequent attempts to interfere with the king's policies were met with less and less patience from him. Those who had hoped that Jane might be more successful at influencing Henry's decisions than either of her predecessors were disappointed. For Henry, regardless of his wife's entreaties, refused to reconcile with his eldest daughter unless she repudiated the Pope, acknowledged Henry as head of the Church, affirmed the illegitimacy of her parents' marriage, and admitted her own bastardy. Henry, via a letter from Thomas Cromwell, even threatened her with treason and a death sentence should she refuse to submit. Despite her failure to exert her influence over Henry's decisions as head of state and church, Jane's seemingly sincere dedication to her religious and moral beliefs is one quality which speaks in her favour. She honoured her promise to Chapuis and treated Lady Mary kindly and generously, spending a great deal of time with her at court. She also continued to urge Henry to reinstate Mary to the succession. This suggests that even if she had not become pregnant, Jane was just as committed to the notion of a Catholic heir for England as the faction which had helped to make her queen. Once she was on the throne, there was really nothing to force her to continue pursuing a pro-Catholic agenda, except her own conviction. This might help explain her seeming reluctance to reach out to Henry's younger daughter, Princess Elizabeth. Jane showed no hesitation to treat Mary as her stepdaughter and close companion, but did not extend the same to Elizabeth, who was not yet 4 years old when her mother died. Perhaps Jane felt she could not speak for Elizabeth without daring the wrath of Henry, who might very well have bridled at any reference to his late wife. Perhaps Jane's own dislike for Anne Boleyn made her hesitant to embrace Elizabeth as her stepdaughter. Whatever the reason, Elizabeth's household and the child herself were less and less adequately provided for during the months that followed her mother's death. Within 6 months, Elizabeth's servants and caretakers were poaching game to keep her household fed, and no one seemed to care that she had outgrown all of her clothes without the means to have new ones made. It was Lady Mary who seems to have advocated for her younger sister, a sister she had resented having to serve but whom she had compassion for as a child too young to understand how dramatically her life and status had changed. Mary may have had more to do with Elizabeth's restoration to the family fold and to Henry's favour than her stepmother had. Jane did appear to have priorities, however. During the year following her marriage, Jane tried on multiple occasions to persuade Henry to halt Protestant reforms and to show mercy and understanding to those who found the changes hard to accept. During the campaign, known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, when thousands of people in the north of England rose in rebellion, Queen Jane begged Henry to restore the monasteries which were being dissolved across England. Henry reacted badly, offering Jane a harsh warning by reminding her what had happened to Anne Boleyn. Jane became pregnant early in 1537, and by late spring she was experiencing pregnancy cravings, notably for quail and quail's eggs. Henry was jubilant and set about making plans for the celebrations that would accompany the birth of his heir and finally Queen Jane's coronation, which Henry intended to be one of the most spectacular ever staged for an English queen. Jane's pregnancy was largely placid, and she seemed contented and in general good health throughout. The Queen entered her confinement early in September of 1537, roughly 1 month before the expected delivery. She was accompanied by the few women permitted to attend a queen during the late stages of pregnancy, including the now 21-year-old Lady Mary. Jane Seymour went into labour on the 9th of October. When Henry was informed, he excitedly ordered that preparations begin for the ceremonial 2,000-gun salute, for Te Deums to be sung in every church, for free food and wine to be provided for the people, and for the bonfires to be lit to celebrate his son's birth. But the hours passed, then a full day, then another, and still the Queen's labour continued. Finally, at 2 o'clock in the morning on the 12th of October 1537, exhausted and racked with pain, Jane gave birth to Henry's longed-for son and heir, the future Edward VI of England. The Queen remained at rest for several days following Edward's birth before she was churched, or purified and thus permitted to leave her formal confinement. She appeared drained, weak, and even paler than usual, but it had been almost a week since the birth, and most of the court considered her to be out of danger. But on the 17th, she came down with a raging fever and lapsed into delirium. Throughout the following week, Jane rallied briefly twice, regaining consciousness and appearing to make small improvements. But rather than making the hoped-for full recovery, Jane died quietly on the 24th of October 1537 at the age of 29. She had succumbed to what most historians between the 18th and 20th centuries believed was puerperal fever, or childbed fever, which resulted from an infection contracted during delivery, perhaps from unsterilized medical equipment. However, multiple sources contemporary with the actual event claim that Jane died as a result of surgery attempted during labour, specifically a caesarean section. The midwives and physicians who had attended the Queen during her labour had begun to lose hope of a safe delivery by the morning of the 11th of October. Several sources claim that one or more of them approached Henry on the matter of the child's survival versus Jane's should the labour continue and a choice need to be made. Some sources claim that Henry chose Jane, others that he chose the child. What these professionals were essentially asking was whether Henry would allow a caesarean section to be performed on the Queen if it appeared that the child might perish with her. Caesarean sections were known in Tudor England, but were extremely taboo because they virtually always killed the mother. They were therefore not typically performed on living women, but more often on women after they had died during childbirth. Later historians tended to suppose that the accounts which described Henry's choosing to save the life of the child were Catholic propaganda designed to discredit Henry, which is why they discounted the claims that Jane underwent surgery. Yet some of these sources were written by reformers and Protestants, and some claim that Jane herself consented to the procedure. Based on the descriptions of her symptoms during her final illness, Jane Seymour almost certainly died of sepsis arising from an infection sustained during childbirth. But the atmosphere of the birthing chamber was so rarefied, and the veracity of multiple accounts so difficult to judge, that we may never know exactly why she died. Following Jane's death, more than 2 years would pass before Henry once again found his way to the altar. In January of 1540, he wed the 24-year-old German princess Anne of Cleves, a marriage that lasted only 6 months. Traditionally, Jane has been remembered as Henry's most loved, most favoured, and most revered wife, and that was certainly the impression that Henry wished to convey. Jane Seymour was given a magnificent funeral, worthy of the Queen of England even though she had not lived long enough to be officially crowned Queen. Henry also requested that he be buried next to Jane. The portrait painted during Henry's marriage to Catherine Parr, known as the family of Henry VIII, shows Henry surrounded by his children, but instead of Catherine Parr, Jane Seymour is painted standing in the place reserved for Henry's queen. The fact that some histories have depicted Jane as a rather saint-like figure probably has much to do with her overall demeanour and personality, but also, perhaps more important, the manner of her death. What could be more selfless to someone like Henry than to die giving him the son he desired above all things? Yet, despite her traditional historical reputation, Jane was probably no better or worse a person than Anne Boleyn, who has more often been vilified for usurping Catherine's place than Jane has been for usurping Anne's. Historians still wonder, did Henry truly love Jane more than any of his other wives? Or was it just that she died before his love could fade? Was it simply because she gave birth to his son? And why would he revere for the rest of his life a woman he had loved for little more than a year, yet also ban all images and forbid all discussion in his presence of the woman who had consumed his life and heart throughout the previous decade? It speaks eloquently of the guilt Henry almost certainly felt about Anne, that after her death he ordered all of her emblems and all images of her to be removed from royal residences, and no one ever heard him speak of her again. What do you think of Jane Seymour? Please let us know in the comments section, and as always, thank you very much for watching.